So in the previous lecture, we installed Flutter, Xcode, and Android Studio, and we made sure that all these tools are set up and configured. Now we want to create our first Flutter app and run it on one of these emulators. And for this, you should first of all go into a folder in your terminal here where you want to create and store that Flutter project. You can use the cd command for that to navigate around. And here in my case, I will go into a playground folder, which sits in a global development folder, but you can create and use any folder structure you want. Move into that folder here in your terminal, and that's really important because the path into which you moved here will be used for storing that Flutter project that we are about to create. And therefore, once you switched to the appropriate folder, you can then run flutter create to create a new Flutter project. You also need to give that project a name, and I'll name it first_app, but the name is up to you. And then once you run this command, a new folder with that name, first step in my case, will be created in the path into which you navigated before. Now here I'll hit enter, and this will now quickly create this project. Now we also see two commands here, which we could now use to already start our Flutter app, assuming that we do have an emulator up and running, but I actually don't want to do this right away. Instead, I now want to install an extra tool which we will use for writing our code. We could use Android Studio for that, but Android Studio is quite heavy and a bit slow, and I personally don't like it too much, so my personal preference is a different tool. And that tool is called Visual Studio Code, which is a free IDE, a free development environment provided by Microsoft, which you can use for all kinds of programming languages, and Flutter and Dart are no exceptions. So you can visit code.visualstudio.com to download it from there. It's available for all operating systems, and your operating system should be selected here by default. So you can then download Visual Studio Code, and once that download finished, simply install it by opening that downloaded file and following the instructions here. It's really straightforward. Once you did install it, you can open it and you should see a starting screen that looks something like that. The exact look might differ over time, but it should look something like that. Now, here I have this dark look, and you can get this as well by going to the menu, and then there under Code, Preferences, Color Theme, you can choose the color theme, and I'm using that Dark Plus theme, but you can of course try out different themes here. But I like this a lot. The great thing about Visual Studio Code is also that you can install a lot of extensions there, which make your life easier. And there are a couple of extensions which I'm using in this course, which you absolutely should install as well. And for that, you can go to this extensions part here in that sidebar, or by using that shortcut, or by using View, Extensions. And then here, the first extension you need is the Flutter extension. So search for Flutter, and then make sure you install that extension. That's an extension maintained by the official Dart and Flutter team, and it will make developing Flutter apps with Visual Studio Code much easier. So definitely install that. That will then automatically also install another extension, the Dart extension, which you don't need to install separately, therefore, which also helps with writing Dart code, and since Flutter uses Dart, this is also helpful. Now I'll quickly reload here since I'm prompted for that, but that's now the first step. And then there is one last extension which you can also install, and that's the Material Icon extension. Now this is purely visual, but I'm using it throughout this course. It changes the file icons in our project, so I will install it, and then after installing it, choose it here to set it. And this is just cosmetics, it's not required, but I like the look of the file icons this gives me. Okay, now we got all these extensions installed. Now we can go here to the Explorer and open a new folder, open a new project into Visual Studio Code so that we can edit it here. And here I'm simply picking that first app folder, which I created a second ago with Flutter create, and open that here in Visual Studio Code. I'm opening the entire folder. I'm not selecting the files in there, but the entire folder, and click open. And this will now give me this project set up here. Now, the exact files and folders you might be getting could differ a little bit over time, but you should have a lib folder, you should have an Android and an iOS folder, since we are on macOS here. You should have a test folder, you should have a pubspec.yaml file, and then you're pretty much good to go. Now, since the exact folder structure and also the starting project you get can differ over time, attached you find my pubspec.yaml file and my main.dart file, and you should use these attached files to replace your main.dart file in the lib folder with mine, and delete any other Dart files you might have in there if you have more than just main.dart. Delete anything else so that you have just a lib folder with my attached main.dart file in there. And replace your pubspec.yaml file with mine, simply to make following along with this course and this lecture much easier. Now, I will walk you through these folders and files and what they do in the next course section. So for the moment, we'll just take them for granted and ignore them. I can say that the pubspec.yaml file is an important configuration file for our project, and the lib folder holds the main source code for our project. So it's that lib folder in which we will write our Flutter code. But I don't want to dive too much into that right now. We'll do that in the next section. Instead, I now want to start this Flutter project on an emulator so that we can see this Flutter app in action. And for this, what you can do is in Visual Studio Code, go to Terminal, New Terminal here, to open your regular system terminal, but integrate it into this project here, integrated into Visual Studio Code, which is good because that means you can have your code and this terminal on the same screen. And then here in this terminal, what you can do to run this project is you can run Flutter run. But before you do that, you need to make sure that you have an emulator up and running. And that could be the iOS emulator or the Android emulator. Now here I'll go for the Android emulator, since I will use the Android emulator for the majority of this course, since Windows students can only build for Android, and hence I want to use the emulator all the students can use here. You could also use iOS, but if you're facing any problems there, ignore them for now. Later in the course, I will in detail again show you how to configure Xcode and run your Flutter app on a real iOS device and on an iOS simulator. So for the moment, I'll use Android here. And hence, in Android Studio, open that AVD Manager as we learned it in the previous course lecture. And then start that emulator that I created there again, so that I have this Android emulator up and running, which I can use for testing my Android app, my Flutter app on Android. Here it is, starting up. Let me close this here. And now that the Android emulator is up and running for me here, back here in Visual Studio Code, in this integrated terminal, we can run Flutter run. And what this should do normally is it should now convert this Flutter project into an Android app and start it on the Android emulator. It won't do that if you don't have an emulator up and running. Then it might try to start this as a web application, but we're not focusing on web applications in this course, so really make sure you have your Android emulator up and running. Now, if Flutter Run would still run your Flutter app as a web app, so not on that Android emulator, you can also control for which target device this app is built and executed by making sure that in Visual Studio Code, you're able to view the status bar, because in that status bar, at the bottom, you can click on this device, and that might be saying Chrome or no device for you or anything like that. But you can then click on that device thing here at the bottom, and then simply choose your target device. And here you should choose your emulator, your simulator. You should choose an iOS or Android device here. And then once you did select a device here, Flutter Run will build this app for this device and run the app on this device. Now, the first time you start this, it can take a while because it's going through that complete build process. It's converting your Flutter code to machine code and building it as an Android app. Under the hood, it's using Android Studio for that, and therefore the first time you run this can take a while. So let's be patient here and wait for this startup process to finish. And now it's installing that build app on the emulator. So here on the emulator, you see that something is happening. And here we go now. This now is running, and you can tell that it's running by the fact that I'm not getting any error here, that I see a couple of commands which I can use. I'll come back to them later, and that this process didn't finish. I'm not back in that regular input mode again. Instead, we now have this running administration mode here where we can administer the running application. And I'll come back to what I mean with that in a second. If you have a look at the emulator, you should see this output here with that starting project I gave to you. And here you got this button, which you can click. And if you do click this button here, you have this counter that increments. It might be a bit slow initially, but no worries, that's not Flutter in general, but this emulator can be a bit slow, also depending on your hardware. And since I'm recording my screen whilst using it, it's especially not extremely fast. But you should be able to interact here, and this is now our first Flutter app built as an Android app running on an Android phone. A virtual one, but still an Android phone. And the code for that app is here in main.dart. Now again, we'll dive into that code and understand it throughout the course, starting in the next course section. But in the end, here we have the code for rendering this user interface, for rendering a couple of those so-called widgets on this user interface, and for managing that counter. Now, what's nice about the development experience you get with Flutter is that after this initial start here, you don't have to stop this running process and run Flutter Run again whenever you change anything in your code, but instead you can make code changes and reload, hot reload as it's called, that running application to see changes immediately. For example, let's say here in line 58, we want to change counter to set it equal to counter plus 2. You don't need to fully understand the code yet, but what this will do is it will make sure that whenever we click the button, the counter is not incremented by 1, but instead increased by 2. If you do that and you save the file by pressing Command Save or using File Save, then right now it still increments by 1 if I click the button. But here in this terminal, you see that we got a couple of commands we can issue. And one of them is the hot reload command, which simply means that our updated code will be injected into this running app, which is nice during development. So by pressing R once, it will perform that hot reload. And now you see I still have my old counter here, but if I now click plus, it's increased by 2. So that code change was injected into the running app. And that makes development super efficient because we don't have to stop everything and restart the entire app just because we made one tiny code change. Now, if this breaks for some reason or doesn't work, you can always also do a full restart by pressing Shift R, and then it will restart the app. The counter will therefore reset to 0 here, but you still don't need to quit the entire process and run Flutter run again. Instead, it just restarted the app based on the latest code now. And that's how our development flow could look like when using Flutter run in the terminal. But I'm saying could look like because with Visual Studio Code and the Flutter extension installed there, we don't even have to use this approach. Instead, I'll quit this running process here by pressing Ctrl-C here in that terminal, and I'll close that terminal. Instead of using Flutter run there, which you could, I'm going to go to my menu here and then run, and then here we can start debugging this app or run it without debugging. And that's what I'll do here. I'll choose run without debugging. And what this will do for me now here is it will again start this Flutter app on this emulator, but it will execute Flutter run behind the scenes. Now for you, it might first of all prompt you how you want to run this application. It might show a little drop down where you can then choose Dart as an option, or Flutter and Dart. So choose that option if you are prompted to choose how to execute this app. Choose Dart and Flutter or just Dart in the drop down you might be getting there. Once this is running, you also might get this pop-up regarding the Dart DevTools, and here we'll dive into them later. I'll choose Not Now for now. And now we also got this terminal down there, but it's actually not the same terminal as before. It's just a debug console that logs some warnings or some information messages to us that we might be getting. But we now got this part here with some controls that we can use to control the running app. For example, here we got this flash, which is now our hot reload button. So instead of pressing R, we can click this button to hot reload. But we don't even have to do that. If I change my code and save this, this will actually be issued automatically. So now Flutter will watch my code changes here, and whenever I save my code after changing it, it will automatically trigger a hot reload. So then I automatically get this new code in effect here. So we could manually trigger it by clicking the flash, but we don't have to. If we want to do a full hot restart, we can click this green arrow here and then do that restart, which we previously did by pressing Shift R. And if we're done for the moment, we can press this stop icon to stop running this, and then it will terminate this. We can close this console, and we can always rerun by again choosing run without debugging. So that's how we will now manage and run this Flutter app for the rest of this course, since this simply is a bit more convenient than having to use Flutter run and having to hot reload manually. That's why I'm using this Flutter extension-driven approach instead. Now with that, we have the development setup we need for macOS for building Flutter projects as apps for iOS and Android. And therefore now in the next lectures, I'll show the same approach for Windows. Of course, you can skip that if you are only using macOS. And in the next course section, I will then dive into that code a bit more, and we're going to learn how Flutter and Dart works from the ground up. Before we do that though, in the next lectures after the Windows setup, I'll walk you through what you can expect from the course and through some other aspects of working with Flutter as well.